Well, when I was I think I was 32, I received a phone call from the Friends World Committee for Consultation, which is kind of the Quaker group that embraces all branches and elements of Quakerism worldwide. And they were calling to see if I would serve on their executive committee. Now, this was a big deal in Quakerism, like being asked to serve on the College of Cardinals to appoint the new pope. And I was certain a mistake had been made, but agreed to do it, knowing it would allow me to see the country on someone else's dime, since I didn't have many dimes of my own back then. My first meeting was in Philadelphia, in the heart of American Quakerism. I flew in, was picked up at the airport by a local Quaker, driven to the Race Street Friends Meeting House downtown, and escorted to the room where the executive committee had gathered. I walked in the room and people were staring at me, smiling, but looking confused, which is when it occurred to me they had asked the wrong Gulley. And that the proper thing to do would be for me to step down so they could appoint the right Gulley, the Gulley they had intended to appoint, the recently retired president of George Fox College. But I knew they were too nice to ask me to step down, so I stayed put. And over the next 4 years, traveled all around America, New York City, Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, Arizona, Oregon, Vermont, free of charge, meeting the most wonderful Quakers. I wasn't asked to serve a second term. I heard on the grapevine that it was because I lacked financial savvy, even though I am the only person in history to get the Quakers to pay for 12 mini vacations around the United States. Crazy like a fox. But the Quaker lady who picked me up at the airport in Philadelphia was driving this raggedy old Honda Civic. It was just all beat up and dented and rusty. And everyone at that conference, when we arrived, I just saw all of these Honda Civics. Apparently Honda was the sponsoring automotive company sponsoring Quakerism that year. Everyone there was driving raggedy old Honda Civics, but the lady driving me let it slip that she also owned a Mercedes, but never drove it to the meeting house. She admitted this, never drove it to the meeting house because the other Quakers would frown at such extravagance. She had her Mercedes for going to the symphony and her Honda Civic for her Quaker duties in deference to our testimony on simplicity. We Quakers take our simplicity very seriously. Well, we've been talking about Quaker testimonies, about democratic discernment and consistent compassion. So today I want to talk about simplicity and want to invite us to begin to think of simplicity in a new light, not as plainly dressed people living in tiny homes, driving Honda Civics, but rather begin to think of simplicity as generosity. The problem with simplicity is its tendency to make us study one another a little too closely, a bit too critically in order to judge whether a fellow Quaker is sufficiently frugal. When the testimony of simplicity was emerging among friends, it was meant to serve as a corrective against mindless consumption that too often claimed our attention and our energies. Unfortunately, after a while, simplicity became a contest to see who among us could appear more thrifty and prudent. Simplicity became less a spiritual discipline and more a competition. And once that happened, the sacred value of simplicity was sucked right out of it. The question for the Quaker shouldn't be how much we earn, unless, of course, our earning is done through the exploitation of others or arises from an unhealthy compulsion or obsession with material wealth. I used to think, when I first became a Quaker and began thinking seriously about all this, I used to think that if someone were wealthy, it was because their values and priorities were distorted. But now, I think some people are born into wealth and some are not. That some people are gifted, tremendously gifted at creating things others want or need, and as a consequence, generate wealth. Having wealth is not in and of itself a moral failure. Misusing or hoarding our wealth is. The question for the Quaker should be the use of our wealth, the employment of our resources. In our old understanding, if someone lived simply while piling up oceans of money, they would be admired by their fellow Quakers as properly frugal. But who among us would say the obscene accumulation of wealth was a healthy spiritual practice? This is why I would invite friends today to shift away from simplicity and move toward generosity, which I believe is a truer measure of our spiritual well-being. Let's not think about how little we spend, but rather how extravagantly we share, how generously we give. It is not wrong to make money. Some people have that gift. The American publisher Malcolm Forbes once said, "I made my money the old-fashioned way. I was very nice to a wealthy relative right before he died." It isn't wrong to make money. It isn't wrong to make money, but the use of money is a very real indication of our spiritual well-being. It reveals more about us than just about anything else we do. Our privilege, the fruits of our labor, isn't something to be ashamed of. Our privilege is a blanket we are asked to share with those who would otherwise shiver in the cold. Got a story for you. It's about a husband and wife I met a dozen or so years ago while speaking at a Baptist church. I'm always surprised at the people I meet whenever I go to a Baptist church. My first surprise is why they would invite me there in the first place. And then the people I meet at Baptist churches are just amazing. They just defy all my expectations of Baptists. And so I met this woman and her husband. Their names are Marguerite and Paul. And Marguerite texts me 2 or 3 times a week to ask how I'm doing and if I know of anyone at all who needs prayer. Marguerite and Paul liked the old church songs, the old gospel songs. And so back when everyone had to stay home because of COVID and we were just sitting around kind of disconnected from one another, Marguerite and Paul, who loved to sing, and Marguerite plays the guitar, began taping themselves singing an old gospel tune, and then would email it out to everybody. And so ever since then, I always begin my day with a Marguerite and Paul song. And it's the first thing I look at each day. Paul and Marguerite sing the song. They live in a part of Virginia where there are lots of old homesteads, where the houses are now gone. The pastures have gone back to woodland, but you can tell where the houses once stood because of the daffodils that were planted by the farm wives 100 years ago. Decades ago, when they were still working before they retired, Paul and Marguerite contacted the landowners of those woods to ask if they could pick the daffodils. And the landowner said, help yourself. And you know what happens with daffodils? They just spread and they spread and they spread. And so the landowner said, help yourself. So every spring, Paul and Marguerite go out into the woodlots and the pastures and pick the daffodils. Marguerite picks them, and I think Paul was an accountant, so he has a little sheet, and he totals them up. He counts each one they cut and records it in a ledger. This year, so far, they have picked 3,960 daffodils and took bouquets to 117 people. Mostly people who are alone, who are poor, or who are sick, who no one else pays attention to. What Paul and Marguerite do is share their blanket with people who would otherwise shiver in the cold. I don't care if you all live simply. That's up to you. I do care if you live generously. I care if we use our money, our music, our flowers to bring a little joy to those who need it. I care deeply about that. Let's not impress one another with our simplicity. Let's inspire one another with our generosity. Share our money. Share our song. Share our flowers.